Well, I would think 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is one of our more favorite go-to passages when we talk about love. It always seems appropriate to read maybe during a wedding ceremony to talk about love and what are the qualities and the attributes of love. And certainly that, I think, is what Paul is getting to when he is writing this in 1 Corinthians 13. But even as we talked about this morning in Bible class, we were talking about preaching and somehow trying to make sure that things are in context. Chapter 13, 1 Corinthians 13 seems like a strange placement of this kind of text that Paul includes here, because the church in Corinth had a lot of problems and had a lot of issues. And ultimately what chapter 13 is about is saying that a lot of their struggles in the Corinthian church, not all of them, because some of them are doctrinal, so they needed more knowledge, but a lot of them could be resolved if they had more love. And so Paul is trying to help them to come up with practical ways that they can show love, they can give love, they can receive love. In our world today, people have a hard time maybe putting their finger on love, because maybe they hear words, I love you, but then followed up by very little action or actions of unlove. Or sometimes people may say, well, I love you, which means I just have this funny feeling about you. I don't really know how to describe it, so I can just say it's funny, because funny can either be good or bad, but I do have a funny feeling about you. And, it's all inside, and, so we call it love, and it's just maybe based more on emotion than it is in reality, so it's not really lived out very well. But Paul is trying to say, can we come up with ways that we can actually, maybe put two words together? So love and verbs. So verb is an action thing. It's a way that we actually are going to be practicing and living and showing and expressing something. So love verbs is what I want to talk about over the next several weeks. So today is just the introduction, which is verses 1-3, and then we're going to get into the specifics of what he describes. This is love. Love is patient, and love is kind. And he goes on through a list of describing qualities of love, which obviously, again, those are not just found here in 1 Corinthians 13, but Paul is going to be describing what love is. So I thought we'd start maybe by looking at a context and maybe even understanding verses 1-3 of what those may even mean, because sometimes we just read through them because we want to get to the good stuff, or we read them, without much thought about what does this really mean. So we're trying to work through this idea of what is Paul trying to communicate to this church that is struggling and how they're struggling. So 1 Corinthians chapter 12 obviously is, the verse just before we get to verse 13. So 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul's been saying, you've got a lot of these spiritual gifts, and because you've got spiritual gifts, somehow you think you're pretty spiritual. And really what he's going to end up saying is, if you're really spiritual, it's going to show up in your love, because that's what God is. We sang the song, God is love. Now, God has given us his word. He's given us prophecy. He's given us the truth. In the first century church in Corinth, he gave them different gifts, and one of the gifts was even speaking in tongues. So by the time you get to 1 Corinthians 12, but by the time you get to chapter 14, it almost like the whole chapter is talking about, well, how do you use and edify and maybe even limit this speaking in tongues? So evidently they thought speaking in tongues is a really big deal. But Paul's saying, there's more to it than this. There's something that's even more excellent than receiving a word of knowledge. There's something more excellent than speaking in tongues. There's something more excellent about spiritual gifts than just the gift themselves. He's going to go on to say it's all about love. It's the more excellent way. And so that's the first 3 verses of chapter 13. This is the excellent way. The other way, it's important. I mean, where would the church be, especially back then, if they didn't have somebody getting up with a word of knowledge, right? Or maybe even the gift of prophecy, or the gift of tongues, or interpretation of tongues, right? So the way they go together is what I just said, speaking in tongues and interpretation of tongues. If you have somebody speaking in tongues with no interpreter, and it's a tongue that no one understands, so they're speaking in a language no one knows, it's not helpful to anybody. It's not useful. It's not practical. And that's the way gifts are without love. And it's sometimes a weird way for us to look at it, because we think sometimes people can do something really nice and it may not be out of love, but at least somebody's being helped. Does that make sense? So somebody may say, I'm going to give $1 million to help feed the the orphans in Russia, right? Now, the reason I'm really doing it is so that I can get a tax break. So motive, not really that good, but at least somebody's benefiting, right? Orphans in Russia, benefiting by $1 million. They're ahead. So there's some benefit of people doing things, even if it's not from the best of motives. But he's saying, how much better would it be if we actually were living by our motives? Because if our motives aren't good, a lot of times we end up doing good, but then we end up doing bad as well. We're not really thinking about people, right? What are we thinking about? Me. How's this going to help me? How's this going to help me look? How's this going to help my taxes? How's this going to help my business? How's this going to help my reputation? How's this even going to help? And I think in the church we kind of know that we're not trying to earn our way to heaven, but how's this going to help with my relationship with God? That God's going to think, well, Peter, you didn't really live a very moral life, but you sure gave a lot of money. So good job, Peter. We'll let you in. You kind of really bought your way into heaven, didn't you there? Fine job, right? So some people maybe think, I'm doing something for God, and he's going to be indebted to me because I gave so much time, or I gave so much of my ability, or I gave so much of my money. So what's the motive behind all this? And I think that's what Paul is trying to dig into about our motive really needs to be love. And that's why Jesus said the greatest commandment, first of all, to love God, all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Second, to love your neighbors yourself. It's about love. And love is going to control and oversee and motivate all the other actions and all the other words and all the other attitudes. All the things in our life is going to be directed and really controlled by love. So he's going to get into what is the most excellent way. So getting right into the text then, 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 1. Okay, so he says, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but I do not have love, I'm a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. So there are two basic ways you can look at this, that what is this speaking in tongues of men? And so that would appear like that's what he was talking about in 1 Corinthians 12, and he will again in chapter 14, speaking in tongues. And evidently the church thought it was a really big deal. It was one of the best gifts there were, speaking in tongues. They thought it was probably more important than prophecy, or more important than encouraging or edifying, just speaking in tongues. And so Paul spent a lot of time dealing with that spiritual gift of speaking in tongues. But Paul says, even if I can speak in all the tongues, you can say, well, I can speak in any tongue. I can speak Italian. Now again, speaking in tongues, a miraculous gift they didn't study. So not only are you pretty smart as far as it looks, but you're also pretty spiritual because God gave you that gift. You didn't give me that gift, right? But he's saying if I can speak in the tongues of men, so he's almost implying if I can speak in all the tongues of men, I can speak all the languages. So this great gift I could have, but if I do not have love, what good is that? How's that going to help? Because what would happen if I could speak in the tongues of men? Well, I'm going to use that gift to, as Paul sometimes would say, to make myself boastful or proud or arrogant, right? So sometimes he says, knowledge can puff up, but love builds up. So if I have too much knowledge and I'm too much into myself, I'm thinking about me. But if I'm saying I want to love, I'm thinking about you. What's going to be beneficial? So I can speak words. Some people may even think sometimes on a Sunday I speak too many words. That's supposed to be funny. So, but speaking words, but if they're not helpful, what good is that? So we think, how can I be helpful? And that's going to be me thinking about what do you need? So I don't necessarily want to come across like I'm really eloquent. I know sometimes people like learning a new word every week. And so they use that word, and sometimes they're big words that nobody really knows. So they look like they're pretty smart, right? And you can get to the point where you do that, you're almost like a college professor. I don't think any of our college professors are here, so I can talk bad about them. I think our college professors are good. But sometimes you can speak above everybody's head, and nobody has an idea what you've talked about. You go away thinking, great lecture, we were there for an hour. But I don't think I learned anything because he was like using those big words that I didn't know what they were. So it's not very helpful. So he looks pretty smart, right? Well, he's a college professor with a PhD, so we call him Mr. Smarty Pants, right? But he's not helping anybody. right? So we think about how can I use whatever gift I have to help others. So even if I speak in a tongue or many tongues, how's that going to help others? Now, other commentators may say something like this. This, almost in quotation, the tongues of men and of angels was kind of a way, kind of we would say a colloquialism or just kind of an expression of the day of saying, man, that guy, he was so eloquent in his speech, the way he presented it, the illustrations he used, he had great body language, just everything was great about the presentation. It's like, oh, he was speaking in the tongues of the angels, that type of thing. Or like people sometimes would say, he's speaking for the gods, kind of like it's that big and lofty, right? So impressed. And some people may think that's what this quotation means. I can speak in the tongues of men and of angels. It's like, whoa, he's good. But even if I was that good in speaking, in presenting a message, but if I don't have love, then that's what he's saying. And so what does it end up like? It just doesn't really help very much, because if I don't have love, I'm a resounding gong. I don't know. I guess gongs are good for something. Now, did anybody used to watch the Gong Show? I know you all are too young to ever remember the Gong Show, but at least it ends the performance, right? Gong, you got to get off the stage now. So by the way, kids, it's kind of like American Idol, except instead of pushing the buzzer, you could. So American Idol's apparently been around for a long time. The Gong Show, right? But but what does a gong do? You just keep hitting it over and over and over again. It's not even very musical. Now, if you are hitting the gong and there's other music playing, maybe that would be helpful, right? So I'm not against an orchestra, somebody having cymbals or a gong or a drum, but that alone can get pretty monotonous after a while. Again, if you want to be a good public speaker or even a preacher, try not to be too monotonous, right? You have to add something to it so that people are being blessed. A resounding gong, clanging cymbal. So we want to do more than that. And that means that we have to have love. And sometimes that even comes across, and Paul would say this. Paul would say this even to Timothy, right? We talked about this morning in our class about preaching, that Paul told Timothy to watch yourself and your doctrine closely. In doing so, you will save not only yourself, but those who hear you. 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12. So watch your life and your doctrine. Because if you do not have a life that backs up your message, then you've lost credibility. And people are a lot less willing or open to listening and learning and taking seriously what you say. So you try to make sure, we would say you're not being a hypocrite, right? It doesn't mean you have to be perfect in order to present something, but you have to be at least trying to live what you preach. So watch your life and your doctrine. And so, because if you're not watching your love, again, you get people where they're tuning out and they're not paying attention because you're just sounding like a gong. There's too many barriers in the way with the discussion. And so you can imagine the Corinthian church is like that. So somebody gets up, and you know what he's going to do. He's going to speak in a tongue because he does it every week. Does the same thing. And he may go on for, 10 or 15 minutes and speaking in a tongue. And nobody knows what he's saying, and there's no interpreter. And it's a waste of time. And we think, here it is again, Brother Alexandria is getting up and he's speaking in his tongue again. He's making a big deal about himself. And there's no love involved. It's just about him. It's a show. What good is that? So what Paul's going to say is, how do we express our life in a way of love that can connect with people, make sense to people, communicate with people, right? So it's not only our words, our actions, our motives, what we do. How do we love without just saying words that don't mean anything? So that's kind of number one. And that's kind of a bigger introduction than we had before. But it's kind of interesting that this kind of comes up in other places. This idea of following people based on how well they speak. So I was thinking today, where does this come up in the book of Corinthians? You remember chapter 1? 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 12, Paul says, the church is divided in Corinth. They've got all these little groups. And what they've got is their favorite preachers. And so somebody said, well, I like Paul. Somebody says, I like Apollos. And somebody else said, well, I like Cephas. So Cephas is Peter. So you got Paul, Peter, and Apollos. So we know who Paul is. Now, Paul himself would even say, I'm not that eloquent when I speak. Like, I'm not the most polished speaker we've got in the sermon series. There's other people. And Peter, now I don't know what kind of a speaker he was. I don't know if maybe he seemed to be maybe more of an emotional person and certainly somebody who's willing to share a lot. And so some people like Peter. And maybe it wasn't just based on what they said, but maybe it was based on their preaching style, which again comes down to this: if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, how well you speak. It's not all about how well you speak. But the other guy's Apollos. So who's Apollos? Well, we read about Apollos in Acts chapter 18, and Paul met Apollos, and it says he was eloquent in the scriptures, and he was able to explain and to preach and to speak, right, in a way that, use the word eloquent. That's what people want. I want to hear an eloquent speaker. Like, he is engaging. You want to listen. He's very maybe practical. He's got a lot of information. It's not just what he knows, but the way he's able to express it. So Acts chapter 18:24, it says there that Apollos was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. He'd been instructed in the way of the Lord. Being fervent in spirit, nothing wrong with having a fervent preacher. He spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he only knew of the baptism of John. Verse 26 says he began speaking boldly in the synagogue. So again, he's very strong. And when bold, it just kind of maybe talking about he's not holding anything back. He's just telling it like it is. And then Priscilla and Aquila heard him. They took him aside, explained the word more accurately. Then Apollos went out again and preached. Now he had the truth. There it says in verse 28, he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. So there's a lot of things there that talk about how Apollos was able to teach or preach or share the message. And Paul may have thought, well, I'm not like that. So don't be judging people all the time based only on, right, their delivery or even only what they say, but there's also this idea of love. So we think about love. And that seems to be obviously the focus here of 1 Corinthians 13. Verse 2, if I have the gift of prophecy. So prophecy is generally the ability to foretell the future. Prophecy is sometimes receiving a word from God that hadn't yet been given. So in the first century, they did not have the Bible like this. They did not have the New Testament at all. Corinth, I'm not sure if they perhaps may have had one of the Gospels. Maybe, we don't know. But, they needed divine revelation for people to know what the truth was. Paul had come through and preached, and Paul wasn't there anymore. Maybe at this time, Timothy was there, maybe, or at least Timothy was on the way, but they relied on prophecy being revealed to them by God, by the Holy Spirit. So they spoke kind of in a miraculous way through inspiration of the Spirit working in their life and moving their heart. Didn't have the Bible. So a gift of prophecy, of being able to stand up and speak a word from the Lord. And again, it was in a miraculous way. So you can get pretty proud about that this is my gift. This is what I'm able to do because I'm spiritual, I'm knowledgeable, I'm familiar with God's will, and maybe even I understand the Old Testament scriptures. So, I'm a few grades ahead of everybody else. But if you don't have love, he's saying that amounts to nothing really. It's you can't even really encourage and motivate and change people if you have pride and if you have, well, I'm better than you kind of spirit. You can have the gift of prophecy. You can fathom mysteries and have all knowledge. And if I have a faith that can move mountains. So some people say, well, I have a little bit of knowledge, but let's say you had all knowledge. You could understand all the questions people ask. Today, people ask all kinds of questions about God. And a lot of times I say, I don't really know. The Bible doesn't really address that issue. But let's say I had all the answers. People would be impressed, wouldn't they? About knowledge, about understanding, about wisdom, about discerning mysteries. It'd be impressive. But if you don't have love, that's not really building up the church. It's maybe making some people smarter, but that's not really what's most important. And even if I had this great faith, I could move mountains. Jesus talked about having faith that could move mountains. But that's a lot of faith. You have more faith than most people. Maybe you have the gift of faith. God's blessed you with a certain spirit of saying, I trust in God fully and wholly, and I've got a great faith. But if you don't have love, that's nothing. It's not going to help. And then he gives one last illustration. If I give all I possess to the poor. You ever met somebody like that? No, you haven't. You've met people maybe that have given a lot to the poor or given most of what they have. But could you imagine somebody give everything? Everything. So just think about from where you are right now, wherever you are, in life, that you say, well, I've got a house, I'm going to sell that, my car and all my clothes, except maybe just the clothes on my back, all the extra food, all the toys I have, all the stuff in my basement, my attic, and my garage. I'm going to give it all to the poor, all of it. We think, wow, somebody had that kind of commitment. It's got to count for something, but he says, if I don't have love, I don't gain anything. It doesn't mean anything. That'd be a big sacrifice. Could you think of a bigger sacrifice than that of saying, I'm going to give everything away? Well, maybe there'd be one more. But if I surrender my body to the flames, I'm going to follow Christ, and if that means I'm going to be burned at the stake, I'm willing to do that. So you think, what a great commitment that somebody would remain faithful even to the point of not only dying, but being tortured when you're dying. That's got to count for something, doesn't it? Hang on for a second. It says, you gain nothing. It's strange to even think about these scenarios, right? But let's think about the last one. Somebody who's willing to give their body to the flames. In other words, willing to die for what I believe in. People have done that. But some non-Christians have done that. And some non-Christians have done it not out of love, but out of hate. Like, for instance, I could just say Numbers 9/11. What does that mean? That means there's some people that were willing to die, literally in flames, for hate. Let me just check this one more time. If I give my body to the flames, but I don't have love, what does that accomplish? Nothing. What have I gained? Nothing. Now, some people that were behind this would say, well, they've given the biggest sacrifice, the greatest gift they could ever give, their own life. But it was not done in love. So what have they gained? Really nothing. Well, why did they do it? We don't always know motives why people do what they do. Maybe because they wanted to get a name for themselves. That sounds pretty selfish, though, doesn't it? Killing other people so you can have a name for yourself. I mean, today, even people that mass murder, even in America, why would people do that? Become famous? Is that why? I mean, if you're not happy with life, I'm not promoting this, but just go out and commit suicide and don't be going around killing, 30 other people on your way out. Why wouldn't you just do that? Because you're selfish? Because you're a hater? Because you don't care about anything or anybody else except yourself? I realize there's got to be a lot of anger under there. I can't figure it out psychologically because I'm not a psychologist, but there's stuff going on, I understand, but it's not love. So people can even die for ulterior motives. People can give everything away for ulterior motives. People can do all kinds of things that even sometimes look like it's good, that it's righteous, or even spiritual. But if it's not done from the right motive, it's nothing. I just hit the wrong button. See, if we're going backwards, we may be here all night. All right, so this is what he says. There's tongues. This is what he talked about here in 1 Corinthians 13. But tongues is also mentioned in chapter 12. There's prophecy. Again, those ideas. Knowledge, wisdom, faith, and giving. So all those ideas that we just talked about are found either very directly or sometimes in an indirect way in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. That's why when he gets to 13, he uses these illustrations of speaking, tongues, prophecy, and knowledge, and wisdom, and faith, and even giving yourself. Because that's what the Corinthians were dealing with. So he's going to go on to talk about the better way. And what does love look like? That's kind of why I thought I would leave the rest to another week, or else we would be here a while longer, because we're just kind of getting started. So we're going to sing a song, I Am Resolved No Longer to Linger. And if we can encourage you in your Christian walk, if today you want to make a decision to follow Christ, to be baptized, that your sins could be forgiven, and you'd receive the Spirit, and you could begin a new life in Christ, let's stand, we'll sing, and let's know how we can be a blessing to you.